This is Danny Michael, Associate Curator of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West Cody Firearms Museum, which hosts a wide array of Wild West weaponry, artifacts, and relics. Today he's joining us to break down just a few of the details and objects found in the world of Red Dead Redemption 2.
He works the lever there. He works the lever to open the action, and when he does that, that'll eject the spent case. And then as he closes the lever, that'll pull in the next round in from the magazine tube that's in the buttstock here.
I highly recommend checking out the Buffalo Bill Center of the West and Cody Firearms Museum. All of that information will be in the description below. We have a second part covering Red Dead Redemption 2 coming soon, so make sure to subscribe for that. And consider this your spoiler warning for the game if you've not got round to playing yet. But without further ado, let's see what a Wild West expert makes of Red Dead Redemption 2.
Yeah, and this looks a lot like period photos for Western towns. This is probably maybe a little bit earlier time period. You know, it's hard to tell because towns would sort of develop on their own over time. But you see a lot of wood frame structures early on in a town's life, you know, tents really early, and then very quickly replaced by like wood, and then eventually replaced by brick and stone buildings. As towns developed in the sort of mid 1860s to late 1800s, you know, a lot of them went through that transformation. So if the game is sort of 1899, this is probably a relatively, in theory, recently founded town. So it's got everything you need. You got your stockyard, you have your blacksmith, you got a small hotel, a saloon, a doctor, you know, the dirt streets, and like some stuff set up with sort of nice boardwalks and some stuff just set up next to the road. That all pretty well relates to like period photographs. So if somebody, you know, goes and looks at those, they'd see that.
Ladies?
Good Lord. Is that your blood?
What's your problem? Partner? Hello.
Again, like in this clip of going through the city, you see a lot of pretty common features. You know, they seem to have done their homework on like period photographs of urban cities and urban locations. There's the sort of stone or cobblestone streets. There's the trolley tracks. Trolleys were really popular, you know, and as a way to get around cities at the time. That would last into the 20th century. You see what looks like at that corner, a little bit of like flatiron architecture that's pretty heavily associated with the 19th century. Lots of different shops, hand-painted signs. It's really great detail for the game. It like really builds the environment. And of course, you know, mention the trolley's got to go somewhere if there's tracks, and having that in game as a way to get around is a really nice touch that you can actually ride around, even if it's not necessarily the fastest way to, instead of sprinting around on your horse. But yeah, I think if anybody were to sort of go be inspired by the game to go explore like period photographs of small towns on the frontier or Western cities like Denver or someplace like that, you'd find a lot of similarities to like late 1880s, 1890s, and especially in the city. Here you see Arthur sort of walking around this market, which would be really common, I think, for a city of the era. You know, there's small markets in cities today where you can go to like a farmer's market, something like that. They would have looked a little bit different. This one, you know, seems to be intended to be sort of a lower income market. There's a lot of different ethnicities represented. You saw some folks speaking Cantonese, and that's one thing that would be pretty accurate for the time period.
Hey, sir. Hello, sir.
So Hollywood has kind of given us this impression that a lot of, you know, that cowboys were mostly white, and that's not really accurate. There are Native Americans, there are Black, there are Hispanic cowboys. A lot of the traditions come from those cultures as well that we think of as cowboy traditions. That in itself is, of course, a melting pot. City scenes like this would have been a melting pot. There have been a lot of immigrants in a city setting like this in the late 1800s, especially if you're thinking in Western cities with Chinese immigration. You saw somebody speaking Cantonese there. So yeah, this is I think a pretty good attempt to represent not just the normal stereotypical cowboy view of the Old West. So here we see Arthur using what in game is called the carbine repeater, but is based on the real life Spencer repeating rifle and carbine. So Arthur's using a carbine version that they made a longer version that was a rifle. Those are a lot less common. You can see that Arthur, he's pretty slick when he works the lever on the Spencer. So he grabs the hammer there, you can see each time. I'm going to pause it there actually. So you see Arthur working the lever and the hammer on a Spencer very quickly, and he's very slick at it. It's a little bit harder than he makes it look in the game. So this is the Spencer carbine based, or what the in-game carbine repeater is based on. Very much the same gun. They did a really good job of modeling it in-game. As you'll see in this clip, they get pretty much all the features right. This one's what's called a model 1865. There's a couple small variations on the Spencers, but they're generally very similar. What Arthur is doing as he works the lever there, he works the lever to open the action, and when he does that, that'll eject the spent case. And then as he closes the lever, that'll pull in the next round in from the magazine tube that's in the buttstock here. It's a 7-round magazine, which is also accurately represented in the game. And then what Arthur's doing as he closes that lever and pulls his hand back on the trigger, he's cocking the hammer all the way back every time. So when he's doing that in one really swift motion. Most people that shoot these or shoot reproductions of these will do them in 2 separate stages. But yeah, that levering and then closing the lever and then grabbing the hammer are usually separate steps on the Spencer. But Arthur's gotten very good with his, so he can do that in one really slick motion. So you see Arthur reload right there, and what he's actually doing is reloading the tubular magazine in the stock. You can see this small door. I think you can see it on the screen there. You can see that small door. It spins to the side there. That spins to the side, and then the tube slides out, and you can insert a new tube. And Arthur appears to have a second tube so that he doesn't have to slow down and reload the first tube. So there's a couple ways you can reload these. Is you can pull that tube all the way out, put 7 new cartridges in the tube, and then put it back in. Or if you have a second tube ready to go, you can reload it that way. The Spencer's a really interesting choice, I think, for sort of the starting long gun of the game. After the American Civil War in the 1860s, these were very common. They made over 100,000 of these during the war. Most were sold off as surplus. Some went to Europe during the Franco-Prussian War, but a lot were sold as surplus in the American West. So somebody like Arthur could have gotten these very cheaply in the 1860s, 1870s. By 1890s, when the game is set, it's probably pretty outdated. There probably weren't many in active use by that point. The ammunition is a proprietary rimfire cartridge called 5650 Spencer, and that would have been pretty hard to come by the 1899. But an interesting choice because it would have been very prevalent in the West as you think about sort of guns after the Civil War. This one would have been pretty cheap and pretty readily available. So to me, it's a really, really good choice for sort of your starting long gun in the game. And they do a really good job of modeling it. You have the correct animations for the lever, the hammer, the reload. That's all right. Arthur's probably a little better than most at using it, but that's pretty understandable for his character. So yeah, a really interesting choice and a really well-modeled choice.
You borrowed money from my business partner, Herr Strauss. You owe him, you took the money. He wants it back. What's not to understand? Where's our money?
I don't have it.
So here we see this man who we learn is kind of ill, cough and get something on Arthur. And we don't see it take effect right away. As the game goes through, Arthur starts to get sick and gets sick with what's called consumption or TB for tuberculosis. And one of the things that wasn't well understood in the late 1800s was how tuberculosis was spread. It was a pretty common disease. It actually impacted a lot of people, spread pretty rapidly, and could be a deadly disease at that time. And one of the reasons was that folks didn't understand very well how it spread. And of course, it was a highly contagious disease. Now we see a little bit later in the game, Arthur is suffering here. He's symptomatic. Your character's kind of in and out and doesn't have great vision. tuberculosis would sort of settle in your lungs and damage your lungs. And one of the common symptoms, that we see both the guy before him have is coughing and then eventually coughing up blood. It's a really common symptom. A lot of the treatments at the time, once they began to realize there were treatments, were to send people to warmer, drier climates, like the American Southwest. And then once folks began to sort of understand the disease a little better, by the time the game takes place, there have been some discoveries made that started to take hold and help improve treatments for TB. So then you see sort of a sanatorium movement where folks would go to stay, and they would do a really good job of trying to keep things clean, because that had an impact on the disease, to get people fresh air, those movements to eat healthier. Those all things were attempts to help patients suffering from this. And actually in the late 1890s, when the game set, it wouldn't be impossible that Arthur could have gotten a diagnosis by x-ray. Actually, the medical x-ray had just been invented in the mid 1890s and was very quickly used to start diagnosis. So while it's probably unlikely, it wouldn't have been entirely impossible to get an x-ray. Here he's paying the doctor, he's pretty symptomatic. Some of the common treatments at the time, especially before the disease was well understood, people would self-medicate with alcohol, often use opium, and use both in conjunction. Doc Holliday, famous gunfighter for the OK Corral, he's a well-known person that suffered from TB, and he's well known to have used whiskey and opium to sort of cope with his symptoms and kind of stay functional in spite of a pretty severe case of TB.
What is it?
It's not good news.
I guess that.
You got tuberculosis. Really sorry for you, son. It's a hell of a thing.
One of the common things about TB was that it sort of, the people suffering from it would turn sort of kind of pale, a little bit ashen. Their skin tone would change. So we see that reflected in Arthur's appearance here as he suffers from tuberculosis.
Get your goddamn hands up! This is a goddamn robbery!
Nobody move! Get word up! Nobody move! Don't make us hurt you! Here! Unlock the door!
So we're obviously seeing a bank robbery here. There's actually, if you want to get involved in history at the academic level, there's a pretty significant, well, maybe not significant, but there's a niche debate, we'll say, about actually how common bank robberies were in the Old West. The general consensus is they're not that common in the Old West. Some of the studies you'll see, you'll put the number as low as just like a dozen or so over several decades. I think that's probably an undercount myself, but I think the underlying theme is right, that bank robberies in the West weren't as common as they're portrayed in TV and movies and, of course, video games, but they do make for a lot more compelling gameplay than not robbing the bank. One of the reasons that bank robberies might have been less common than we think of is that one of the things about the Old West is there was sort of a continual physical currency shortage. So it wasn't always the most lucrative thing to hit the bank. It's also a lot more conspicuous as you see the gangs trying to get out through town right here. In a small town like this, most people are going to know what's going on in town that day. So these guys probably would have stood out, and it gives them a lot more chance to get caught versus like a stagecoach or a train robbery where they might be out with a lot less people around. So those are two big deterrents to bank robberies in the Old West, having a lot of people around and the lack of actual physical currency that was often short in the West.
All right. Yeah! Right! Get the hell out!
So here you see a shootout start with the gang members as they're trying to leave the Valentine Bank. And this is actually in some of the bank robberies that are documented in the Old West. That was a relatively common occurrence to the bank robberies, because the locals would figure out what's going on, realize that it's their own money, that if they don't get it then, they're not getting it back, and would take up arms against the robbers to try and prevent them from robbing the bank. That happened really famously in Minnesota. I believe, I think I'm getting that right. The Northfield robbery, I want to say. And it also happened actually here in Cody, so where the museum's at. Cody had its own bank robbery at one point. Suffice to say, the Cody locals heard there was a bank robbery going on in town. Two robbers attempting to escape actually got in a gunfight outside of the Irma Hotel that's still here in town. The original building that was the bank is now a jewelry store. but there was a shootout across the street. One of the bank employees was killed. The 2 robbers managed to make their escape and not get caught, but it ended in a shootout and a chase with the actual Cody locals because it was their money on the line. So this scene is, pretty representative that the locals would find out and potentially even shoot back. So here we see Arthur getting into a quick draw scenario over this slight, and obviously he wins the quick draw. There were a few duels in the West. There were gunfights in the West. They tended to look more like what we might imagine the OK Corral, close and confused, not necessarily the standout in the street, but there were famously at least a few sort of standout in the street Hollywood style duels. They got really popular in dime novels and then got really popular, of course, in popular media because of that. They're not nearly as common as portrayed. There's really just a handful that happened in the West. One of the most famous being Wild Bill Hickok. He got into a duel, I think in St. Louis, over a pocket watch and a debt he allegedly owed. The guy insulted a former friend, insulted him over the pocket watch. Then he challenged a friend to effectively a duel. And it was very much based in the sense of a grudge and a grievance, and this score had to be settled, and everybody sort of viewed it as a thing of honor. And so it was very much the kind of duel where 2 guys faced off in the street. Hickok won that duel and killed the other guy. He was tried and acquitted for murder, but that's just one of a few examples. Just really a handful of examples throughout the entire Western period. I think that one happened in the late 1860s, and there's just a handful more in the next few decades in the West.
You know what? I don't know.
If you'd like to see more of Danny as well as other Wild West episodes, make sure to like the video and let us know in the comments. I hope you'll join me in thanking Danny and the Cody Firearms Museum for collaborating with us on this video. You can check out some of their videos as well as all of their other information in the description below.